All right, so now we're going to get into Cantos 9 through 12, and we're going to be looking at these. These are some pretty interesting cantos. Probably will not take as long as some of the other videos, but they should be full of information that is helpful for you as well. All right, so Canto 9, we're looking at the Furies and Medusa. And Canto 9 is sort of a segue as we're moving through the city of Dis. We're going to be moving there, and then we're going to kind of stop for a second as we get onto the circle of the violent, the seventh circle. So in lines 5 and 6, you see once again Dante's talking about there being a thick fog. We've had this since the very beginning of the entire poem, and where Dante can't see things, where Dante is confused, where Dante is sort of unable to tell what's going on around him. So, whether the thick fog is metaphorical or a physical symbol for what's going on internally inside of him, it becomes this sort of part of the thematic motif that's consistent throughout the entire poem of Dante's difficulty to see. So that's what we start with lines 5 and 6 here in there. Now, they're waiting on some sort of angel or a messenger to arrive to help them get through the city of Dis. And there's this real sense of uncertainty. It's the first time that we've seen that same uncertainty that is in Dante throughout, also in Virgil. And so Virgil has also lost his certainty at this point, in this junction. So now not only Dante is uncertain, but also Virgil is. And that just shows sort of how they have not been able to, neither of them have been in the city of Dis at this point, and shows just how much that they're going to have to rely on sort of a sense of providence to get them through it, not just Virgil alone as being the one who takes Dante. So they meet up with the Furies. Now, the three Furies, of course, Sybil describes them in the Aeneid, and she describes them as sort of the gatekeepers to the city of Dis. So Dante is, of course, getting it from. They are consistently, referred to in Shakespeare as sort of the Fates. So you have the Fates, the Furies, and here you see that they're sort of beating their chests and they're clawing at themselves, and so there's this just gesture of rage and grief. And then we come, of course, to Medusa, who's a Gorgon, and she basically turns people into stone. So that's something that we see consistently happening. So Medusa is, of course, the Gorgon that turns people into stone. And there's this really interesting play on words as the Furies talk about how they want to turn Dante into concrete. And so there's a real sort of like little humor there in line 52. Theseus was, of course, imprisoned in Hades, and Hercules rescues him. And that's sort of the Greek version of the harrowing of hell. And so Dante, of course, taking the Greek ideas and syncretizing them to the Christian idea. So you see with Medusa, there's that sense in there for Theseus and Hercules and that sort of harrowing. Ovid, of course, interprets Medusa as sort of this representative of fear, somebody who would be able to paralyze people. And then others around the same time saw her as a prostitute that was so beautiful she destroys men. That's, of course, a lot of the patriarchal interpretation that's going to kind of come on and develop as people look at women as sort of they're so beautiful they destroy men, they do that or whatever. But Dante really doesn't seem to go in that direction. He seems to focus more on this idea of fear. And then Augustine also interprets it in a sense of the hardening of the heart, that she turns people into stone, that sort of hardening of the heart that you see happening in Egypt and the Exodus and all throughout the New Testament as well. The thundering sound, there's this thundering that comes, and it's representing the approach of that messenger from heaven. Though it's interesting that it subsides when he becomes visible. It also draws on the account of the harrowing of hell as well, being sent from heaven, and also in the idea of sent from heaven and an angel from heaven are really interchangeable. Sent being sort of it's the verbal form of messenger, and messenger is the same thing as what angelos means in Greek. And then in line 94, why do you kick back? This line is echoing the words that Christ gave to Paul. Hey, Paul, why are you why are you going out against me? And Jesus, nobody ever reads that second verse there where he says, why are you persecuting me, Paul? And he says, is it hard for you to kick against the goad? And that's this sort of Greek idiom where a goad was sort of like a cattle prod. It's hard to kick against the cattle prod. It's hard to go against this. So it's a reference here that Dante is using as the same thing that Jesus says to Paul in Acts. And then in lines 112 to 115, there's this talking about these tombs that they're coming to, and they're talking about the Arliss tombs. And according to legend, these tombs at Arliss sort of miraculously enclosed all the Christians that were dead after this huge battle that Charlemagne had led against the Muslims during the Crusades. So it's drawing on that imagery there as well. Then at the end of the canto, Dante and Virgil both turn to the right. Aeneas and Sybil, they turn to the right outside the walls because they can't enter in, and that way they can't see evil, they can't bear it. But since Dante is inside the walls, this is sort of emphasizing this idea of as he turns to the right, he has to see the evil. He's got to see evil in its entirety. And that's the importance of being able to turn to the right here that Dante is drawing on. So then we move on to Canto 10, which is the Heretics. And in simple terms, heresy is just this belief of, a wrong belief. And that's what the sin is, just the sin of wrong belief, believing the wrong thing. So Dante has conversations with two different sinners, and one conversation is about politics and the other is about poetry. Therefore, it's really important for us to ask, what do these have to do with heresy? And we'll get to that in just a second. But both of these men are in a tomb, their covers are lifted off, no one is standing guard. So that's sort of this play on the iconography of the resurrection narrative, the contrapasso once again happening here where the punishment fits the crime. So the idea here is that these two men are not going to be resurrected. They're not going to have this, and yet they have sort of the counter look of what the resurrection was like because they are heretics. They're the wrong belief. And so they're the opposite version of the resurrection narrative. At the very beginning of it, there's this mention of Epicurus. Epicurus would, of course, be here because of his denial of immortality, according to Dante. He, of course, Epicurus did not believe in immortality, and he would assert that the soul dies. So these people that are in here, they're also asserting that the soul dies. But Dante is suggesting that, secondly, it's adherence to this belief that actually causes the death of their souls, which is a really interesting way to put it. Augustine, once again, Dante draws from Augustine here. Now, Augustine is actually, so a lot of people think that Epicurus is the one to write this quote, let us drink and let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we shall die. They say that's an Epicurus quote. It's actually not. It's more of an attitude that was developed, and Augustine sort of references that attitude in his Confessions. It's also on a play on, Dante's also playing on Psalms 49, where he's talking about the sepulchres being in their house, being their houses forever, sort of their tombs forever. So first, we need to begin with this context here. Dante is walking along, and there are these flaming tombs in hell. And all of a sudden, he sees somebody who's a fellow citizen of his own world. In fact, the citizen even says, "Hey, oh, Tuscan, you Italian." And the next thing that the guy says to him is, "Who are your ancestors?" Now, that does not seem to make sense in any form of the word, but this is what Farinata, this person that we are meeting, does. But we're a long way from Florence, so it appears that that's what they should be talking about is, hey, they are from Florence, so let's talk about Florence. But what Farinata is actually going to ask him before he gets into Florence issues is, who are your ancestors? What he's really saying is your family as good as mine? Is your family, are you part of the aristocracy? And then he asks, well, so what side are you on? Right? Remember, we were talking about politics coming into this Canto. So instead of uniting between them as Florence citizens, instead Farinata is asking questions of division. He asks Dante questions of division both socially and politically. But Dante can tell Farinata here, who Farinata is a Ghibellini, that the Ghibellines are not in power anymore. And guess what? The Guelphs, my people, have trumped you. So Dante actually seems to be doing the same thing Farinata is doing here. And then another character sort of appears behind or beside Farinata. So let's talk just a second about Farinata. So from 1239 until his death, he was the leader of the Ghibellines, which the Ghibellines sort of represented that old military aristocracy. He led the Ghibellines against people in Florence in this horrible, bloody battle in 1260 outside of Florence. And many of the people there wanted to actually raise Florence, but based on him alone, like his decision of no, do not raise Florence, they didn't do that. Later on, after he died, the Franciscan inquisitor Salamone da Luca, probably Lucia in Italian, posthumously condemned Farinata and his wife, and they unburied them. They exhumed their bodies and they burned their bodies into ash and scattered the ashes on unhallowed ground. That's how big of a deal it became. And it actually continued into Farinata's ancestors as well. Not that they would kill them, but they were ostracized by society, of course. So, who's this guy beside Farinata? So, you've got Farinata, and you've got this guy beside Farinata, and that's Cavalcante, and that's the father. It's Cavalcante. He's the father of one of Dante's friends. The man asked Dante if he's in hell because of his great genius, and so we, of course, know that's false, but Dante is messed up and he needs this journey to get back on the right path, right? That's the reason he's there. But Dante decides to accept the premise and he suggests, well, yeah, sure, maybe I'm in hell as a reward. Dante suggests that his son, Guido, that's Cavalcante's son, is not as good as Dante. But the father then notices, he actually says Guido was not as good as me. And the father notices this sort of past tense, and he springs out of the tomb and he says, "Is my son dead? Is my son dead?" He's not. Interestingly enough, the son would die 7 months into 1300. So he was about to die. But at this point, Dante is writing, right, considering it's the holy month of April, so April of 1300. So his son would not be dead. Guido would not be dead at this point. So upon hearing that his son's not dead, he then disappears, and the conversation with Farinata then continues. Farinata is looking for a way to trump Dante, and so he finds it because he's able to foretell Dante's exile. He's able to tell Dante, "Oh yeah, but you are going to go into exile. You're going to be thrown out of Florence." And so it's important that we remember that Dante is constructing this poem in exile. The pilgrim is at the height of his own political power, and he hears essentially, "Hey, you're going to be going into exile." So once in a way, this is prophecy, but then in another way, it's also, of course, history. And then at the end of Canto 10 of the Heretics, there's this mention in line 119 of Frederick II, who was a Holy Roman Emperor. Remember at the beginning that we were talking about how Italy needed to be, people were vying for that power in Italy. And so you had Frederick II and becoming the Holy Roman Emperor, who also wanted the power there. And then the Pope was like, no, you can't. And so there's this fight, and that's where the Guelphs and Ghibellines go on. The Ghibellines, of course, would be the ones that would go and support Frederick II, but they are way out of power by this time. And so there's this sort of reference to Frederick II, and it's in ambiguous terms, but most people interpret it that way. And they think that it's this way because what's interesting is, even though he was called the wonder of the world, he passed laws against heresy. He was also opposed to the popes and to the Guelphs, Dante's people, and he had a lot of friendly diplomatic relationships with Muslim rulers. In fact, he had a lot of interaction with them and allowed them to move throughout the country unabated. So according to Dante here, he of course would be part of the heretical. So things change, huh? Uh, Canto 11, real quickly, is sort of an introduction to violence. It's mostly Virgil just kind of talking about the different types of violence that we're about to see and that we're about to move into. Dante explains these differences in Canto 11 through Virgil. And so Virgil classifies them in three different ways. Violence can be directed at others, ourselves, or God. And then violence against God includes blasphemy, sodomy, usury, and others that he lists. But the last two are also sins against nature and art. And uh, Virgil and Dante consider nature God's child and art God's grandchild, the creative process of creation through that. So, the violence against God is also violence against them as well. And we'll get into a lot more details with that with future cantos. Um, at the beginning of this canto, there's this stench of the sinner, that there's this smell, and there's this sort of smell of evil that Dante's referring to. He probably uses Proverbs 10:7 as the example here. Name of the wicked will rot, and that's just probably an allusion that he's giving. But there's this inscription here as they move in to this seventh circle, to this later circle, and um, it says, I hold Pope Anastasius, whom Photinus drew from the strait away. Now, we don't know who Pope Anastasius is, but Anastasius or Anastasis is the Greek word for resurrect, and then Photinus means little light. So we're not exactly sure what that means, but there's this inscription there, and it's probably playing on this idea of doing the opposite. Once again, the contrapasso. And then in line 22, you have the introduction of malice and that what violence does, what the malice does, and how it goes against the law. And we're not talking about just like made up laws. Dante is putting all law together here. Then the law of nature, human law, and God's law. The violence goes against all of those because after all, it's a Neoplatonic idea that love is the bond that unites everything together. It sort of creates the sort of systemic connection between all things. That's a Platonic idea from Plato, of course. And here we're first introduced to the idea of a malabulge, which just means evil pouch. So you're going to be hearing a lot about that, and it's just a little section. As we look at the circles are made cut into sections, and that's what they call the malabulges. All right, so there's just little evil pouches of sections of different sinners. Dante looks at Virgil and he asks Virgil, like, okay, so what about all these sinners before we got here? Like, what about all the ones that the lustful and all these guys, the gluttonous? Why are they not here? Why are they not taking on such a hard punishment? And so he uses the idea of the why are they with the swamp, the rain, the wind, the stone, and that of course is going to be part of the elements that then equal into blood, bile, and black bile, and then also the elemental idea of hot, wet, dry, cold. In other words, what Virgil says back to him is those sins infect humans, but they don't destroy humans. And so they're much more of the idea of infection. They're a virus, and they infect things, but they don't destroy them. They don't kill them. They're not violently destroyed from that. So that's kind of Virgil's answer to him. All right, so moving on to Canto 12. At the beginning of Canto 12, we see that there's the infamy of Crete, and that is the Minotaur. And the Minotaur is the child of Pasiphae, and who's King Midas' wife, and a white bull. Now, yes, we need to stop here. Lots of metaphorical things going on here. Yes, there's a sense of bestiality, but come on, that's Greek mythology for you, right? So in the story, basically, Daedalus helps her. She falls in love with this white bull, and she wants to have the white bull impregnate her and to make love to her. And so Daedalus helps her by creating a sort of wooden box bull and puts her in it so the fake bull thinks it's her, and then is able to impregnate her. And so then Minos is like, oh, to get his revenge, he has Daedalus make the labyrinth, and then he puts Daedalus in the labyrinth forever. So the Minotaur represents sort of that problematic union of the rational and animal in human beings, that sense of are rational, but then are also our passions, or that sort of animalistic primal instinct that we have. That's what the Minotaur represents, the sort of interchange between the two. Now, there's also a bunch of landslides here. There's a lot of reference to the landslides at the very beginning and then throughout. These simply correlate to the harrowing of hell, the idea that they occurred once the harrowing of hell came down, when Jesus comes down and rips people out. These landslides occurred, and so people shriek and they're upset with them every time they see them and as they pass them, because it reminds them of the redemption that they were excluded from. And then we meet the centaurs, and we get to the centaurs, who once again are very similar to the Minotaurs, but Dante and Virgil go up and they see that there's this gigantic river, the river of blood, that the people that are violent, these violent people are in. And there's that river of blood obviously represents the irascible temperament, the idea of people having fire in their blood, right? It's that comes from an ancient saying, so that idea that violence is inside of blood. So the centaurs, really interestingly enough here, they're not conceived as demons here, and they're also exempt from the punishment that people are getting. They're sort of just watching. And there are two centaurs that are sort of become noticeable. One is Nessus and the other is Chiron. Now, Nessus attempted to carry Hercules' wife off, which is very normal for a centaur to go around and take the virgin of the wedding and take the virgin away and try to carry her off or whatever. But Hercules killed him with an arrow that was dipped in the blood of fire from a fire-breathing hydra. And then the Chiron was the wisest of centaurs, especially he knew a lot about medicine, music, and astronomy, and he was considered to be the teacher of both Hercules and Achilles. You might know him from the Percy Jackson books in the movies as well. That's Chiron. So if you don't know it from Greek mythology, it tends to be that pop culture references make more sense these days. All right, so in 83 and 84, they're talking about the breast of the centaurs, talking about two natures wedded, and that was sort of the place of the union of the rational and animal being. And according to Aristotle, that was the breast, right? And he believed that the soul, with all its powers, dwells in the heart, and that's the place where passion and mind struggle it out. And so that's what's being referred to there by Dante. And then Dante lists, some violent people throughout time. Alexander, most likely Alexander the Great, Attila the Hun, and then Sextus. We don't know if Sextus is Achilles' son or maybe somebody else. There's quite a few different people that could possibly be, but they're all mentioned there, and they're violent offenders, and so Dante sees them there. That's basically Cantos 9 through 12. We've gone from the Fates and the Furies all the way now to the Violent, and we will continue looking at the Violent in the next videos that we see.